Good evening, everyone. We'll begin with the land acknowledgement. This place where we gather is located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor these teachings. And as David said last week, and may we continue to learn. That's why we're here. First of all, I just want to welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth Ivory. I'm one of the chairs of Northumberland Learning Connection. And are there any first-time attendees here tonight? Yay. Hello, welcome. So before we start, I wanted you to know that 50% of the ticket sales for this particular event will be donated to the Fair Share Food Bank. And they are here tonight, over there, you've seen the table, and we'll hear a few words from the Executive Director, Megan Flindle, following our speaker. So last week, I was away in Squamish, BC, visiting my grandkids, but I watched the video, and I'm so interested to hear how Sara Edge will bring home the topic of food insecurity from global to local, or at least to national. About my visit to Squamish, a few words. First of all, it rained nonstop. I mean, nonstop the entire week, which they needed after last summer's fire season. And the second thing, for the first time, I noticed the increased visibility of the local food bank, as I did when I visited Courtenay, BC earlier this year. So in addition to their support for the Blue Jays, food insecurity is something that many Canadians now have in common from, as they say, coast to coast to coast. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about Sara. In 2024, Dr. Sara Edge was appointed to the position of Chair of Food Policy and Society at the Arrell Food Institute of the University of Guelph, where she is also an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics. What are geomatics? Okay, maybe she'll tell us that. Okay. Previously, Sara taught at Toronto Metropolitan University, and she completed a postdoctoral fellowship for the most promising new Canadian scholars at the University of Waterloo. She received her PhD in geography from McMaster and a Master's of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo, where she got to know Jennifer Clapp, who spoke last week. As she said, it's sort of like the circle closing. Sara is dedicated to working with community groups, governmental organizations, and other stakeholders to strengthen equity and justice in access to sustainable, resilient food systems. If you heard her speak by chance this morning on Ontario Morning, you'll know you are in for a most informative presentation. And also, it was a great plug for NLC. So thank you, Sara, very much. And over to you.
Thank you. Am I on? Oh, yes, it's on. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and I had a lovely dinner, and I really appreciate having this opportunity to speak to you about such an important topic. I know some of you have spent some time learning about some of the broader global factors, trends, and emerging innovations that are shaping food systems and food security and access at broader scales in the previous weeks leading up to tonight. I was asked to speak about this issue a little more locally within the Canadian context and how this is manifesting within our own communities and own backyards and exacerbating pre-existing inequities and injustices amongst Canada's increasingly diverse society. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these challenges, but I also want to move beyond a lens of vulnerability and marginalization, which is often used to describe or talk about or subjectify food insecure people. I want to also cast attention onto some of the skills and assets and capacities and emerging innovations that are being driven from within communities that are dealing with food insecurity. How's my volume? Okay? Yeah. And this is because I think a vulnerability lens alone is stigmatizing. It also reinforces unequal power relations and dynamics of dependency. And it can prevent us from recognizing or paying attention to the lessons that we can actually be learning from some of the alternative food pathways that are arising, quite frankly, out of necessity. Now, you may have touched upon the notion of polycrisis or cascading crises in previous weeks, but I do want to recap just briefly to provide some context, particularly for anybody who might have missed out on that. So we do, of course, find ourselves in this time of cascading crises. And between climate chaos and inflation and geopolitical conflict, we've got our tariff disputes, the disruption that was brought on by the pandemic, wildfires and natural disasters, mass migration and displacement. All of this and more is increasingly putting our food systems under great stress, particularly global industrial economic food systems, and by our extension, our ways of living and knowing. At the same time, we've seen growing criticism of corporate concentration among agri-food and grocery retail chains, and record-breaking profits, despite the fact that we have this affordability crisis on our hands affecting the masses. Now, food security is typically defined as the ability to have both physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets the dietary needs and food preferences that are required for an active and healthy life. I'm going to come back to the sufficiency of this definition a little bit later. But the cascading crises that I was just talking about are exposing deep vulnerabilities and structural inequities that already existed in our own backyards and institutions, as well as the related impacts upon populations in our society that have been pushed to the margins. According to a research group called Proof that is led by Dr. Valerie Tarasuk out of the University of Toronto, which draws upon data from Statistics Canada and the Canadian Income Survey, the number of food insecure people in Canada has continued to rise. So last year in 2024, over 25% of people across the 10 provinces live in food insecure households. So this amounts to approximately 10 million people, 2.5 million of which are children, which is approximately a third of all of our children, live in households that are struggling to bring food to the table that they need. This has also marked the third consecutive year of this trend going up. And really, we're seeing the highest levels ever recorded over the past 20 years since we started kind of tracking these trends. And the ways in which this manifests across our country varies quite substantially, both geographically and also across social groups. So the percentage of people living in food insecure households is highest in Nunavut at a whopping 58%, likely underreported, and across the more remote north. Among the 10 provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland are amongst the highest rates. And Quebec actually continues to stand out as having the lowest percentage of people living in food insecure households, which Proof at least attributes to differences in provincial policy. So, for example, policy structures and payments for low-income households in Quebec, such as income support or workplace benefits or childcare, differs from other provinces. And many of Quebec's social policy supports are also indexed with inflation, which makes a huge difference given everything that's going on right now. Oh, did I do that? Oh, okay. All right. It says you're talking too much, probably, right? Okay. Move it along. Okay. Now, experiences of food insecurity, they can range in severity. On the one end, we have more marginal levels of food insecurity where one might worry about running out of food and or be dealing with perhaps limited food selection due to a lack of money. This might also consist of people that have, say, a short-term or episodic moment of food insecurity that might come around when there's an unexpected expense, like broken eyeglasses or an expensive car payment, or, this can squeeze people to the point of not being able to make it through the month or be able to cover all of their bills. And as we move along the continuum, some people may be more moderately food insecure, where they are now actually consistently compromising on the quality or the quantity of food that they or their family consumes. And then, of course, there's the most severe end of the spectrum when people are flat out going without food, missing meals, reducing food intake, or at the most extreme, going days on end without food. And typically people experience different levels of food insecurity. They may go in and out of some of these categories depending on life circumstances. But households dealing with food insecurity are also dealing with broader material deprivation, right? It doesn't stop at food. It can result in compromising housing quality. It might prevent people from being able to put their children in recreational opportunities or post-secondary educational opportunities or other opportunities that can just undermine one's ability to fully flourish or reach their full potential, which is why we often see intergenerational and cyclical food insecurity and poverty. Alarmingly, the increases that we are seeing are greatest among the households that are experiencing that moderate to severe food insecurity. And we can see this trend over the past 5 years, and that's kind of reflected in the darker blue bands in this figure here. Now, while there are geographical disparities across Canada, there are also disparities based on social demographics and race and ethnicity. I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the local context here in Northumberland County, and then I'm going to expand upon this notion of underlying structural and social inequalities later in the presentation. So I'm sure many of you are aware food insecurity is also a mounting issue in Northumberland County. It affects about 11% of households, and while that may be considerably lower in comparison to other parts of Canada, it was reported that in 2023, over 5,000 residents made 74,000 visits to food banks, but the number to pay attention to is was up 32% from the previous year. So that's a pretty considerable uptick. And really that's reflective of what we're seeing everywhere. If you look more regionally, the Haliburton, Kawartha, and Pine Ridge Health Unit, of which Northumberland is a part of at the bottom here, those food insecurity rates tend to be a little bit higher regionally, more in the 18% range of all households. And recently the health unit has created a food insecurity dashboard. And actually in the reference slide at the end, I do link to it, but you can easily find it. If you're interested, you could check that out and find out some additional information. Single parent households, especially those led by single mothers, are amongst the most vulnerable in your local region, with the health unit reporting over 38% of female-led lone parent households dealing with this challenge. Additional vulnerable groups in the community include low-income families, particularly families that are on social assistance. Again, the health unit reports that a family of 4 that's living on Ontario Works needs at least another $1,300 on top of what they're receiving through Ontario Works just to be able to afford rent and food alone, just rent and food. Children, seniors on fixed incomes, people with disabilities, it's coming back here, and renters as well are also disproportionately struggling. It is worth noting that despite the fact that migrant workers, migrant farm workers, play a really vital role in filling agricultural job vacancies that are vital to our food systems and our production, we have really little data or statistics on food insecurity within that population. And it's completely unsustainable and inequitable if our food systems are built upon frontline workers that can't even afford to feed themselves with the food that they work to produce. That's a problem. That's a broken system. There's many known barriers and challenges that put migrants, farm working migrants at risk of food insecurity, such as poor or unfair living conditions, harassment, a lack of workers' rights, getting punished for speaking out, a lack of employer responsibilities, a lack of access to health care, social isolation. This can all be a recipe for disaster, right? And in your region, migrant workers from Mexico, Guatemala, the Caribbean support the agricultural industry here. And locally, organizations like Horizons of Friendship have been working to support migrant farm workers in Cobourg and Northumberland more broadly through their migrant worker outreach program. And they've been reporting that the number of migrant workers that need support is steadily on the rise. They've responded by providing welcoming kits upon their arrival, which includes essential food items. They are trying to raise more awareness about the vital role that migrant farm workers play within food systems. And they've been partnering with local organizations to extend their services to migrant agricultural workers, including the food banks and cultural groups, and trying to provide like free mental health support over the phone, along with legal aid. Now, the research group Proof that I've been citing some of their statistics because they're leaders in illustrating some of the changing trends in food insecurity that are happening in Canada. Their definition of food insecurity, which has been taken up by many organizations, places that emphasis on inadequate or insecure access due to financial constraints. They really emphasize the financial, right? And obviously for good reasons. They argue that the consequences are only going to get worse unless we address the inadequate, insecure incomes that are the primary driver of this problem. They and many other organizations, including your own district health unit, many food banks, many community food centers across Canada, which I'll talk more about in a moment, work tirelessly to advocate federally for key social policy reforms that would help address these growing economic challenges in Canada. So that includes the need for a living wage, ensuring that social assistance rates or old age benefits are in line with the cost of living, pushing for more policy that will strengthen affordable housing, improving employment benefits and insurance, as well as tax relief for low-income populations. And recently, the lead researchers out of this group released a report. They feel so strongly about this, which I'm in agreement with, that the part I'm not in agreement with, and for any of you who heard me on the radio this morning, you might have heard me say this, is that in their efforts to push for investment in these areas, they often, I used to think unintentionally, but I think there's some intention here, pit this advocacy against resource investment that's happening at the community level. Arguing that we have precious public funds and we can't afford to be spending them on initiatives that have no evidence of impact that this actually reduces household food insecurity. My position is that a lack of evidence does not necessarily equate to a lack of effectiveness or impact. It may be more of an indication that our current knowledge or tools for trying to assess or measure the impact of food banks and community food initiatives are just not quite there yet. There really has not been a quality systematic evaluation of the effectiveness of charitable food assistance programs or alternative food programs like community gardens, good food boxes, etc., in reducing food insecurity. Obviously, I'm not saying that the presence of food banks is solving this problem. We can see that that is not the case. But to say that there isn't real impact in terms of supporting the lives of food insecure individuals, I think is not the message we want to be giving. Yes, these are important social policy reforms if we want to curtail this growing problem. I am a proponent of these recommendations, but there's some limits in responding to the issue of food insecurity solely through the lens of household income. This doesn't fully paint the picture of the needs and experiences of vulnerable groups. For example, many of these solutions would not necessarily help the migrant farm workers that I was just talking about, as an example, or the international students that our higher education institutions depend upon and, quite frankly, exploit in order to keep their institutions alive. And we've seen the fallout of that. As the province cut down on educational funding, the solution, bring in more international students. But then half of them are not always welcome in the places where they go to support when they're struggling. Anyone with precarious immigrant status or legal status, or even if it's not precarious, there's often a fear amongst many migrants to utilize some of these programs. They don't want that to be used against them in any way or deported. Further, anybody who's unhoused or struggling with mental illness or addiction may or may not have a fixed address. And a lot of these types of benefits, you kind of fall through the cracks if you don't have that in place. Further, beyond the poverty argument, many households experiencing food insecurity are indeed above the poverty line, which further supports the fact that there are likely other broader structural, social, and environmental determinants of food insecurity that are at play here. Also, many community-based initiatives are about challenging the current status quo system, that current global industrial food system that is inherently unsustainable, inequitable. I believe you probably got a lot of that content in the previous weeks. And increasingly being driven by corporate greed and concentration. So we need to be really careful that some income supplementation measures do not actually turn into subsidies of powerful actors for powerful actors in the marketplace who could then continue to increase rents, continue to increase prices, while consumers remain relatively powerless. Many food programs are therefore going beyond mere notions of addressing food insecurity or food justice while business continues as usual, and instead are rooted in notions of food sovereignty or strengthening community self-determination and alternative food access pathways altogether. And I'm going to unpack some of that in a moment. So many charitable and alternative food programs aim not only to address household food insecurity, but also focus on training, education, skilling, and empowering those who feel powerless in an inequitable system that is dominated by very few powerful actors. Many of these initiatives are moving beyond a focus on increasing or ensuring caloric intake and really questioning things like our modes of production. Who are we doing business with? How do we distribute food? How do we eliminate barriers? How do we uphold the ecological integrity of our land and our water, our air, and our resources upon which food production and our survival depends? We need spaces that inform and empower farmers, small agri-food businesses, entrepreneurs, and consumers. We need to seek food security not just at the household income level, but at that community, national, and global level as well. And in my opinion, income-based adjustments alone, although they're important, while they may indeed help household level income, they will likely not result in more equitable, sustainable food systems. The fact that inequities in food access go deeper than income alone is certainly also reflected in the data. Food insecurity is undoubtedly racialized. The highest percentage of individuals living in food insecure households in 2024 was found among Black or Afro-Caribbean people of descent at a staggering 46.7%. Nearly 40% of Indigenous populations are reported as food insecure. I'm going to come back to the questionable accuracy of that number in a moment. Other racialized migrants with disproportionately high rates include the Filipino population, Arab, Southeast Asian, and South Asian Canadians as well. So Black households are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white households, and nearly twice as likely to be food insecure even when we control for factors like income, like education, and immigration status. So a lot of this can be attributed to the effects of anti-Black racism, including challenges or experiences of discrimination in accessing employment opportunities or housing, as well as problems related to like criminalization. Further gaps in the availability of culturally appropriate food options or cultural procurement networks, and access to enabling infrastructure such as land, transportation, or retail space are all contributing factors here. Immigrant and newcomer populations, which I've touched upon a bit already, but they are also at high risk for a number of social and cultural reasons beyond just income. And in contemporary Canada, we have this situation where all levels of government are engaged in some form of, welcoming communities initiatives or efforts to attract migrants to grow their economies and recover from population decline or to fill critical labor shortages. And so we have this economic dependency on migrants unfolding at the same time that we have this sort of rise in xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments happening at the same time. And of course, along with political pressures to put caps on or restraints on the number of migrants we let in, or at least move towards more responsible growth and demographic change. Migrants who arrived in the past 10 years have more than double the rate of food insecurity than households overall. Number of risk factors, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, culture, class, citizenship, and language, along with labor and housing inequalities, inadequate social supports, difficulties accessing cultural foods, an unfamiliarity with local foodscapes. All of these things can undermine immigrant food security and also participation in food economies. Urban form, or the infrastructure and traits of a community in which people are settling in, is also really important. So the physical environment can undermine food access, especially in geographic regions, and I'm sure this is a challenge here as well, that have been developed where you're really dependent on a car to get around. Walkability may be limited, or public transit may be limited. And other factors include, how supportive is a community or a region in terms of being able to nurture immigrant businesses or ethnic retail? Are there supports that help facilitate access to land and capital? Are there opportunities for social and cultural connection? Over 90% of newcomers up to this point have largely resided in our large, what are often called gateway cities, right? Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. But I'm sure, as you are all observing, this trend is quickly changing, and a lot of suburban, smaller, rural, outlying communities are now becoming sites for migrant settlement due to lower living costs, job opportunities, it's less crowded, labor shortages, probably many of the same reasons that brought you out to living here for many of you, I'm sure. Yet many smaller or rural communities are often underprepared in terms of programs, policies, and infrastructure that's needed to support incoming migrants. a lack of adequate housing, the health and social services, employment opportunities, access to transit, green space, cultural sources, resources, etc. Now, data on rates of food insecurity in Indigenous communities is really sparse and really inconsistent. Statistics Canada reports that there are about 40% of Indigenous peoples living off reserve that are food insecure. However, the Canadian Community Health Survey and now the Canadian Income Survey, they both exclude individuals that are living on reserve, and therefore that data is not reflective of First Nations people living on reserve, who represent nearly half of status First Nations people in Canada. So that's obviously lots of inaccuracies there. Well, this is cut off a little bit, but basically there's a number of factors that lead to these broader structural, social, and environmental determinants at play here. So food systems are shaped by planning and development processes and have really been founded upon settler colonial structures. And their ongoing legacies continue to reinforce sort of this systemic marginalization that we're seeing. And this is characterized by uneven patterns of wealth and land ownership, and by extension of that, unequal influence over land use decision-making, or who gets access for space to grow, process, sell, consume food. There has also been historical and contemporary inequities in access to loans or capital or leases to get food businesses and ventures up off the ground. Also, there's historical processes like redlining. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the concept of redlining, but this idea was first introduced in the United States under Roosevelt's administration. And essentially that was the systematic denial of various services like banking, loans, insurance, to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. So sometimes that's called credit rationing. And the idea was to maximize return on investment. However, over time, this cemented residential segregation, and it also created underserved neighborhoods. While redlining has technically been outlawed, we still see its legacies today, and also the reinforcement of residential segregation of marginalized groups into underserved neighborhoods through more contemporary patterns of gentrification, which brings increased property taxes, increased rents, and often results in displacement of people. Or purposeful disinvestment and service neglect, so that at some point a developer can come in and flip that land and make a huge profit. Mobility constraints are a big factor. Again, I mentioned this particularly for those who do not own a car and who have settled in car-dependent infrastructure or outside of gateway cities. And of course, just this tendency for us to prioritize profit over health, which can lead to food deserts or grocery stores being unwilling to set up shop or remain in particular neighborhoods, which can result in large areas being left without any real food retail available to access. You could do a whole presentation on any of those factors, really. And so a more, I think, contemporary understanding of food insecurity that perhaps brings a more holistic view is informed by this kind of 5 A's framework. And arguably, all of these A's need to be in place in order for food security to occur. The first A is availability, which is really, do we actually have a sufficient supply of food for all people at all times? And I would say, at least within Canada, perhaps the remote north being an exception, our problem is not one of availability. While we have skyrocketing food insecurity happening, we also have unprecedented food waste, with some estimates of up to 50% of all food literally ending up in the landfill. So that's a broken system. Accessibility is the next A, which refers to, of course, economic access, the importance of income, but also physical access. Are we within close enough proximity to actually get to the food that we need? Adequacy is really about, is the food nutritious? Is it safe to eat, or is it spoiled? Is it produced in environmentally sustainable ways? Related to the concept of adequacy is acceptability, which is really about, is the food culturally appropriate, or is it obtained in ways that respect human dignity and human rights? And finally, agency, which is the degree to which people or communities have influence over the policies and processes that actually shape their food access and that are needed to ensure food security for communities. So is there choice, essentially? Do we have choice or influence, or are we just taking what we are given? So we do also see definitions of community level food security. So that scales up, of course, from the household level. And that's a situation, or the definition is when all community residents can obtain a safe, culturally acceptable, nutritionally adequate diet through a sustainable food system that maximizes community self-reliance and social justice. And I would say recognition has grown around the importance of the community sector in responding to the challenges of food insecurity, as governments and the private sector alone are failing to ensure food is accessible for all. And there's a broad literature that is documenting the growing range of community-based initiatives and alternatives and their role in strengthening food system sustainability and security. So that includes initiatives like urban agriculture, community kitchens and gardens, social supermarkets. I'll talk about those more in a moment. Social enterprises, food banks, of course, food hampers, or any kind of combination of these models. We've also seen a proliferation of efforts to invest more in food rescue, given a lot of the food waste that I was just talking about, and redistributing that excess food to the places where it's needed. Some of you may have become familiar with some of these apps that are emerging, like Too Good to Go. A lot of students and others are tapping into that as a way of getting access to that excess food at much more affordable prices, which also helps businesses so that they're not losing out entirely on that loss of product. And when we think about responses to food insecurity, we can think about how different initiatives serve different purposes. They essentially fall along a continuum. So on the left-hand side here, we have more short-term or emergency relief, typically for those who are in acute crisis, right? So food banks, soup kitchens, those who are most food insecure tend to access these resources. It may also be combined with mental health supports to help people cope. And this can serve people who are both chronically food insecure, but also help those who are coping with a very sudden shock, whether that be the loss of a job, an unexpected large payment, a critical illness, a relationship breakdown, these kinds of things that can change our circumstances very quickly. As we move along the continuum, we have initiatives that fall kind of more under the category of capacity building. So they may still be supporting those that are in acute crisis, but a lot of these initiatives are really about fostering more personal and community development and cultural belonging. So activities might include things like community kitchens, community gardens, training programs, shared cooking and eating activities, food pantries, children's holiday clubs or cooking clubs, or voucher schemes. we're hearing more and more about food prescriptions, like food as medicine, right? Where a doctor or service provider might be able to write a prescription for somebody who can then take it to the food bank or take it to a food program, and almost like cash, essentially. On the far end of the spectrum, we have more system redesign, where these kinds of initiatives are actually trying to address those structural systemic issues that I was talking about earlier, and to have greater impact over the long term and not just be putting out fires or slapping on Band-Aids. And a lot of these initiatives are community self-organized. They try to capitalize on local assets and meet community needs. So examples might be like a community land trust, or food sovereignty initiatives that I'll talk about in a moment. That shift towards a living wage could be an example, or even like a social enterprise based on, say, for example, immigrant women's cooking knowledge, where that provides also some level of employment. Cooperative food growing or food procurement that increases the local availability of good food. These are arguably examples of initiatives that are also trying to change the system itself beyond just feeding people. And so across this continuum, we're seeing a growth in movements and initiatives that fall under this sort of guiding principle of food sovereignty or community self-determination. And while such initiatives are unfolding in all kinds of communities, urban to rural, across the country, I do want to give a bit of a nod to the leadership and history of such work that has unfolded through Black food sovereignty and Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives that honestly have been pushing for more sustainable change and equitable alternatives for quite some time. Largely invisible to the masses, though, in terms of their efforts. And food sovereignty is similar to that definition of community food security that I provided, in that it's about the right of people to healthy, culturally appropriate food that's produced through ecologically sound methods, but it places a real emphasis on this right to be able to define our own food systems, and to have some choice over what we can consume, as opposed to a monopolized system alternative. And so food sovereignty or greater community self-determination requires us to rethink about how do we improve or foster more inclusive access to land for localized and regionalized agriculture, but also food processing, distribution, and retail. How do we foster more equitable access to enabling infrastructure, whether that be space, whether that be transportation, or like a cold delivery truck, storage equipment, that sort of thing. But it's also about fostering more inclusive representation in leadership in food system and agricultural policy. I don't know how clear that is, but the following I'm going to provide a few examples from the Black food sovereignty movement in Canada. However, the examples that I'm citing, I think, are also applicable to what's happening in increasingly in community settings and in grassroots initiatives popping up across the country. So organizations like the African Food Basket in Toronto, in collaboration with other community partners, they developed cooperative programs to acquire and distribute culturally appropriate food at minimal costs or even for free. So in the short term, they're providing crucial support to those in need through bi-weekly pop-up food pantries, free deliveries of fresh, culturally sensitive fruits, vegetables, and other staples. More locally, some of your food banks may be attempting to be more inclusive to who they serve by offering like halal or vegetarian or kosher options, or even celiac-friendly options, right? It's not always about culture. It's often about unique dietary needs as well. Historically, it's been difficult to find those kind of foods in a food bank. But there's often a heavy reliance, of course, on volunteers. And while these types of initiatives are still short-term and emergency focused, there is some more agency being exerted in this move away from a reliance on packaged processed food or food waste donations that may lack quality in some cases, to a food bank that prioritizes fruits and vegetables that actually support the immune system, or cultural and specialty crops and goods that you might not be able to get elsewhere, and just an emphasis on a more dignified response. Moving along sort of that continuum I was talking about earlier, we're seeing more examples of communities that are trying to develop farm collectives or learning farms or farm incubators, or a farmer might donate a smaller plot of their land to help prospective farmers gain some skills without having that initial big capital investment. And a lot of these plots are increasingly being connected with local food procurement networks, and are also providing food access through like harvest or cultural festivals, which can also be really important sites or locations for addressing community food insecurity or enhancing access to affordable food. With respect to youth or younger folks specifically, learning demonstration farms can provide spaces for young farmers and youth to develop sustainable ecological agricultural skills, or even skills in farm management or financial management. But for the cases of racialized and marginalized youth, these sites are also sites of cultural reconnection to their ancestral roots. They're sites of storytelling, of intergenerational knowledge exchange, which helps us to reconnect to some of this lost agricultural and ecological knowledge that had previously been passed down through the generations, but perhaps this has been disrupted either due to forced displacement, migration, of course, historically slavery and colonialism for some of these communities, but even for other communities or more white Anglo-Saxon communities that were perhaps not subjected to these processes in the same way. Still, a lot of our agri-food knowledge has been lost, right? With the growth of industrialization, and now, of course, the whole digital era. Many people are completely disconnected from how food is grown and or our relationships with the natural environment. And so these kind of programs, their mission is to use food growing, education, and social innovation also as tools for nurturing leadership and reconnection to land and traditional ecological knowledge, while celebrating culture. And community kitchens can kind of play a very similar role, but with more emphasis on culinary skills and tradition that has largely been lost. And then with respect to long-term change or systemic structural change, that's system redesign, using, again, this example from Black Food Sovereignty, a lot of isolated small Black-led initiatives across the country have been now kind of networking together to form a broader Black Food Sovereignty Alliance, where there's actually a really strong node in Toronto. There's a very strong node of leadership coming out of Detroit, and elsewhere throughout North America, and there's more collective organization or organizing to champion food justice in policy and governance. And an example out of Toronto is many Black stakeholders were working with the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit to convince City Council to unanimously approve the adoption of what was called a Black Food Sovereignty Plan for Toronto. It was adopted in 2021. It's actually the first of its kind in North America. And the plan is intended to be community-led, but municipally supported. And a lot of that emphasis, again, is placed on supporting Black-led or Black-serving access to growing space, investment in alternative and culturally sensitive procurement networks, cultural markets, etc., trying to get access to land, all those things I was talking about earlier. So that's one kind of example of some initiatives that are happening. Another key trend at the community level is greater investment in supports and startup resources that help those who may be usually depicted as dependents, receiving handouts within a food system, to help them role shift towards being more fully active food citizens, if you will, or leaders. And largely that is driven through innovative entrepreneurship. And so one area that I'm certainly interested in, and there's a few others out there as well, but how do we bolster opportunities so that our newcomers that are coming in can actually meaningfully contribute their skills and capacities towards Canada's future food system economy? Now, this is true for all Canadians. It's not just newcomers that I'm talking about. But if we concentrate on immigrant populations in particular, there are calls for greater recognition and leveraging of food-related skills and capacities that in many cases already exist amongst these migrant communities that have not grown up on North American industrial food systems. But a lot of that skill and knowledge currently remains untapped or under-recognized or undervalued. And immigrant communities reconfigure and reinvent food systems and access through their ethnic food entrepreneurship. Immigrant populations represent a very large food consumer market. They actually constitute more than 50% of Canada's food business owners, albeit many are struggling to stay afloat. Immigrants make up a large share of the agri-food labor force, from farming to processing to retail to service. Yet they're often in low wage or precarious positions and are often underrepresented amongst owner operators. They can contribute to very dynamic and vibrant multicultural food economies through their entrepreneurship, and also cultural gatherings that often are surrounding food and actively reshaping Canada's not only food systems, but also our broader built environments and our socio-spatial fabric. Currently, policy narratives and food system infrastructure investments, as well as entrepreneurial innovations, in my opinion, they do not adequately consider immigrant foodways or skills and knowledge. And there's a lot of room to improve how equitable and inclusive agri-food entrepreneurial mentorship is, and accompanying resources and infrastructural supports. I wanted to just play a short clip from a documentary called Globurbia, that was made by my colleague Zhishi Zhuang, that really helps to depict some of the changing food geographies and the role of ethnic food retail within that. So this might just take a second. I'm not going to play the whole thing. If you're interested in this whole video, it's easily searchable through YouTube, but I'm just going to play a little clip to kind of illustrate some of what I'm talking about here.
我哋好似一家人咁樣樣，互相幫助。
When immigrants settle in the suburbs, they bring economic opportunities that can diversify local economy. Many immigrant businesses actually take over declining retail space and significantly transform the neighborhood with new meanings and new identities.
我父亲他从台湾到多伦多，他就知道未来的发展，所以那时候我们在唐人街我们就开了第一家，在1988年。因为之后的随着这个人口的变增，还有一些新移民的进来，所以我们也就看到未来的趋势，所以我们就将我们的店再开Express 那个店在 Scarborough， 华人是在士嘉堡也是开始聚集，因为这之前这个物业是 through 下类，所以 through 下类这边做了30年，那我们重新 modify 它，然后重新以前是一个完全是一个 Western 的一个卖through 下类的那个 鸡的那个食物呢，西方的食物，那我们现在完全把它加入，就是亚洲的那个元素在里面。最重要，我觉得来到我们餐厅就是能够体验到餐的 original flavor， 然后呢可以吃到家乡的味道，也可以吃到在加拿大的中国餐的特色，这才是因为我们还有一半以上的都是 multicultural 的一些客人，多元化客人，各种族裔人都有。基本上我们是前10年是有看，就是以华人的moving 的动向为主作为一个依据，但是如果等到他人都到了，你很难找到一个比较好的 location， 这是我们要提早2-3年在布局。
Brian's business development adapts to the settlement patterns of the co-ethnic community, but the concentration of ethnic businesses can also be beneficial, lending a vibrancy to the community, even if the rest of the city can't always see it.
Everyone always asks, oh, where did you grow up? So I always say, like I grew up in Rexdale. And, people always have that negative connotation with Rexdale, but this area is so much more than that. Yes, we're not downtown Toronto and we're not south of Etobicoke, but we are like a very viable neighborhood. I do think it is important to have the concentration of, South Asian businesses. And I think why it's worked for so long is because, like you need that connection. We do have a lot of immigrants that settle here in North Etobicoke. A lot of these businesses have been here for 20, 30 years. The social connection that the business owners have established with, the residents or their consumers is definitely important. And they know the area in and out, like their children go to school, like just down the street. Why most of these businesses remain here, and they want to really see this area improve. Definitely we promote multicultural businesses that are here, the ethnic businesses that are here, and just a business area as a whole. So we have different shops, whether it be from the South Asian community, the Caribbean community. Just recently we did a couple murals to reflect our neighborhood. The symbolism from the mural just represents what we're all about. The vibrant colors that they use just represents what our BIA is about and what this neighborhood is about.
So part of what I just wanted to demonstrate there is some of the intimate relationship between ethnic food retail and land use change. That isn't always popular amongst everyone, but in many cases, incoming populations are revitalizing spaces that would have otherwise gone to decline altogether. And it also helps illustrate that many newcomers that are coming here have a lot of skills and assets and want to be active contributors to our economies, not recipients and dependent on aid. And so I think it's important when we're talking about food insecurity, not only with respect to migrant populations, to not only view that through kind of a vulnerability lens or a lens of marginalization. There's a lot of assets, skills, and capacities that can be tapped into. Finally, the last kind of community level trend that I wanted to mention tonight is that we're seeing this increase in agri-food related social enterprise. Traditional food retail is often being criticized for being unaffordable, and then food charity is sometimes criticized for having poor quality food sources or undignified spaces. Now, many of those food charities have made a lot of changes in response to those critiques. However, they struggle, right? And there's critiques around charitable dependency in that you're always kind of beholden to the whims of funders or changing governments. And so increasingly we're seeing even a lot of the food charity organizations experiment with social enterprise approaches where there's attempts to have some cost recovery and a little bit more of a financially sustainable model to their operations. And so this can come in different forms, whether it's community food hubs or social supermarkets. Social supermarkets, or sometimes they're called solidarity stores, can generally be characterized as retail outlets that do sell either wholesale or surplus food rescue that's been donated to the space, or but they sell this food at heavily discounted prices and or at sliding scale prices, with a lot of emphasis on local engagement and the needs of local residents. Social supermarkets are often coordinated or co-located with other types of food programming, or also wraparound health and social services, resources, and supports, kind of in a one-stop shop kind of location. As I mentioned, they can offer an alternative to traditional retail or food charity. Social supermarkets, this model has existed in Europe for decades, but only more recently has started to proliferate in the United Kingdom, and we're now starting to see this pop up in North America increasingly as well. There's a lot of unique and diverse models that kind of fall under this category across the Canadian landscape. They differ in terms of how they procure food, what their financial or operational structures are. And we don't have a really good handle on the scope or breadth or impact of these initiatives that are popping up. They're kind of operating in isolation in an ad hoc fashion. I'm in the midst of literally on Monday submitting a grant to try and get some funds to take a closer look at this and to provide some networking opportunities, so that develop a community of practice amongst social supermarkets across the country so they can learn from one another. So I should back up a bit. Over the past couple years, I've been collaborating with an organization called the Rexdale Community Hub. It's located in North Etobicoke, which is a very low income, high density, very ethnoculturally diverse, high rise neighborhood. It can be difficult to get around due to traffic, and there's a lack of food sources in that neighborhood. So we got some funding from the United Way, and we conducted a feasibility study to see would it be feasible to develop a community market in the hub space, the pre-existing space itself, to try and enhance access to affordable nutritional food. And we actually launched this community grocery market not this June, the June before, so it's been in operation for almost a year and a half now. We remain actively involved in kind of evaluating its impact and sustainability. These photos were taken from the day of the launch. I was going to say the municipal councillor's in the photo, but I must have swapped out the photo. That's not the municipal councillor, but it is the hub staff. And the hub, these are all pictures from this social supermarket. They do lend some of their paid staff to support the market, but it's predominantly run by local volunteers and residents who sometimes receive honorariums, but they also gain opportunities for skills training and experience in retail, food safety handling. So far, our focus has really been on providing high quality produce, because a lot of the people who utilize this store would otherwise be dependent on other sources where there just is no fresh produce, or it's of really poor quality. Even the grocery stores themselves, because demand is so high in this area, they either show up and it's all sold out, or like the berries are rotting or whatever is happening, Additional benefits of this market, because it's located in a community hub where there's legal aid, social services, recreational programs, community health center, etc. It provides opportunity for social interaction for seniors who are experiencing social isolation or have trouble getting around, as well as newcomers to the area. Anyone with language barriers in this setting, they can get some support as they navigate the store itself. They have that access to the wraparound supports that I was mentioning, as well as cultural events that are all offered in the same space. And so a couple months ago, myself and my postdoctoral fellow that I've been working with on this project, we put out a call to through our networks just to see if there were other social supermarket initiatives across the country that would be interested in getting together and having conversation. And we had an amazing response. Initiatives from across the country came together to discuss some of their initiatives as well as their common challenges. And we started identifying common challenges related to critical infrastructure gaps, some of the economic constraints or challenges that they continue to deal with, the tricky reliance on volunteers or the challenges of paying staff living wages. What are the challenges related to procuring food? But we also started to realize that there could be a lot of possibility in greater collaboration and networking, and which hence the grant I mentioned just a moment ago. We're trying to develop a community of practice and wondering that, if we are able to scale purchasing power or combine purchasing power, that might be able to bring down prices, because a lot of these isolated initiatives don't have the scale to purchase wholesale, right? So if we combine together, that may solve some of that. Or they want to get into more a digitized inventory, but they can't afford that software. Well, maybe if they're collaborating with others, again, they might be able to get lower licensing fees or something along those lines. And so, we've pulled together this network. It's got partners from both rural and urban spaces, Guelph and surrounding Wellington County, Toronto. We have partners from Vancouver and the West Coast, and also from Quebec, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff. Quebec's way ahead of the game when it comes to food and social supermarkets and the scale at which food access is happening. Anyhow, there's so much more that I could say, but I'm very appreciative of your attention so far, and I just want to wrap things up with some key recaps and closing thoughts. So, yes, food insecurity continues to be on the rise. I don't see this problem going away anytime soon, given everything we have coming at us at the moment. And to combat this problem, we most definitely need to continue to press for government response and accountability through those much needed social policy reforms that I was talking about earlier: living wage, investment in affordable housing, social benefits and costs in line with the cost of living, etc. But we also do not want to just subsidize business as usual. In this era of polycrisis, trade, geopolitical, and socio-ecological challenges, it's never been more important for us to develop stronger, more sustainable, and equitable local and regional food systems. We're all dealing with the uncertainty and the whims of whatever's going on to the south of us. Now's the time for us to shore up. Community initiatives, I think, are poised to play a really important role in light of these growing disruptions to our status quo global industrial systems. While the evidence may be still coming down the pipe, they certainly can improve access to fresh, nutritional produce, foster opportunities for social connection, belonging, information exchange, support mental wellness, reduce our ecological footprints, and provide training in food production, handling, selling, and advocacy. A key challenge is that many community initiatives are not yet reflective of the increasingly diverse populations that they are serving, and this can sometimes reinforce kind of hegemonic interests in food policy and programming. And we've got a growing number of organizations that have not been historically food-focused. For example, immigrant and settlement agencies or community health organizations, cultural organizations, etc., that are increasingly becoming crucial food governance actors. And we've got, again, this growth of both charitable and also social enterprise models at the community level. Governments, funders, and investors can help support more equitable and inclusive food systems through support or mentorship of small business owners, particularly from marginalized communities, whether that be through grants, whether that be through reductions of property and sales taxes, and/or reduced licensing and operating fees. Efforts should be made by institutions and leading organizations to try and diversify their food procurement and purchasing patterns. Others point to the role of land use planning, design, zoning, bylaw processes. You know, we might want to start to be a bit more flexible about where we allow fresh produce outlets to be located, allowing more pop-up markets or pop-up mobile trucks and that sort of thing, and grocery retailers. I think we need to rethink very carefully how we utilize land, who has access to it. I talked about the importance of those demonstration plots or tracts that are devoted to learning farms, along with investment in public spaces, community kitchens and gardens. All of this is hopefully going to collectively help us not only identify, but begin to better evaluate some of these prospects for viable food access alternatives. If left unchecked, community food programs and future food system entrepreneurism and innovation and investment is not going to be reflective of the needs and capacities of Canada's increasingly diverse population and labor force upon which we depend for what for many of us are still pretty good quality lifestyles. This, I think, is a moment of great reset, and with disruption comes opportunity to try and get our food systems back on track so that we can first and foremost provide nutritional, affordable food for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that incredibly thorough and educational presentation. You have so much, I hate to say it again, food for thought, but
Yeah.
I have questions, but I will ask the audience for theirs first, and we'll actually take maybe 5 to 10 minutes of questions because we want to give Megan a chance to
Yes,
tell
of
us
course.
about the Fair Share Food Bank. Questions? Fine. You're next.
Okay.
What is the response of the major retailers to your observation?
What is the response of major retailers? Well, yes. I mean, we are seeing some growth in corporate social responsibility. So, for example, it wasn't very long ago that I didn't see any grocery stores that were willing to divert their food waste to places where it was needed. We would rather lock it up in a dumpster than even give it to their own staff, let alone other people that are hungry that need it. I think that is starting to change. And I think with that also comes corporate pressure, right? Or peer pressure to get on board. One of the challenges with that is it can be both an opportunity and a challenge, which perhaps our friend from the food bank can talk about, because sometimes corporations utilize that as a way of offloading their food waste for a cheap price, well looking good, but end up delivering product that really needs to be thrown in the garbage. And so then you have nonprofits and charitable organizations now dealing with the challenge of waste disposal. Yeah, that's one example anyways. Yeah.
Hi, John Kelly from FairShare. What about a solution? The statistics are out there, they're facts, and they are sad, and if you came back next year, they'd probably be worse. What if guidance counselors at high schools talked to students who did not want to become lawyers, accountants, doctors, nurses, and said, why don't you look at a trade? Become an electrician. Have you tried to get one lately? Or a plumber or a cook? There's a professor at U of T, and he was asked by CBC. He was one of the early people that worked on AI, and they asked him, if you had a son or daughter now going off to school, how would you advise them? And he said, I'd advise them to become a plumber.
Yeah, well,
I'm talking about the future, so 3 to 5 years, if you have somebody that comes out of school that has a trade and has a job, then likely they won't be at a food bank.
Yes, I mean, these are big questions here. I do think there's something to be said for encouraging some of our youth to get back to some basics in terms of skills. I was talking earlier to someone in the audience about soft skills like relationship building, being able to have communication, rapport, trust, but to what you're talking about, also very tangible hands-on skills in ways that hopefully AI cannot replicate and put them out of work. And, you know, so I'm part of, you know, I am part of two different worlds where I bridge between food access and distribution and very grassroots community level initiatives in responding to this challenge. But I also have a bit of a window into the agri-tech innovation production side of things. And the worlds couldn't be further apart from each other. So I think maybe this isn't exactly your point, but I think we need to ensure those silos are busted down, because otherwise a lot of investment is going into agri-tech and automation and AI, and although there's lots of opportunity there, I have concerns that could actually make things a lot worse, while lining the pockets of a few. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to the next question. Can I ask you quickly if you would give us a few insights about why Quebec is doing it better?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll be honest, I hope to learn more about that myself through this grant and collaborating more with the colleagues from Quebec. But I think it is a combination of what I was alluding to earlier, just greater social policy that are focused on income-based measures, a greater social safety net. But when I was in Montreal last year, it had been a while since I'd been there. If you walk along the street level, there's all kinds of small-scale social supermarkets. I don't even know if they're social enterprise or nonprofit or for-profit, but the scale of operation is much smaller. It's not just monopolized big box stores on every, few blocks. And so I suspect that has a lot to do with it as well. More investment in small-scale businesses where the money stays locally. Yeah.
So I wondered if you had any particular comments about seniors in Canadian communities, not necessarily in the immigrant, newcomer communities or racialized communities, just regular old seniors.
Yeah.
And what challenges do they have with food insecurity, and how do they address them?
Yes. So for many seniors, it can be a challenge of income, fixed income, absolutely. But for many, income's not even the biggest challenge. Mobility is a challenge, not just mobility on two levels. Literally mobility within their own home in some cases, in terms of being able to get up, utilize their kitchen equipment, maybe starting to deal with a bit of early onset dementia where it could be hazardous, like do you remember to turn your stove off, like things like that. Or, and then of course, broader mobility, physically being able to get out to a grocery store if they've now got to a point where they're not driving anymore, whether willingly or by force. That's a big problem, especially for seniors that are living in smaller outlying communities where you can't just hop on a bus, where there isn't necessarily mobile home delivery. And related to that is the problem of social isolation. And so I think that's one of the biggest importance of some of these community-driven initiatives is it's not just feeding people, but it literally is a lifeline for some folks. Even folks that receive Meals on Wheels programs, for example, sometimes that's the only person they get to see all week. And those little moments of social interaction can have a huge impact on quality of life, cognition, checking to see if someone's okay, especially if they don't have family locally. So that's a lot of what I'm seeing. And certainly during COVID, especially, or any time where cold and flu season is abundant, that isolation goes up further because people are a high-risk population. And even if there is bus transit, they may be afraid to get on that bus because they don't want to get sick during times of high transmission. Yeah, so isolation, I think, is almost isolation and mobility are probably just as much of a risk as income for seniors. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I'm going to give you a break now. And
Okay,
call Megan
yes,
up, and thank
absolutely.
you so much for
Thank you.
responding to those questions. And now we'll ask Megan to share some of her insights about the local situation. I think, do you here, just use this. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I was so riveted by this topic and this discussion and what we were learning this evening. I almost forgot I had to come up here and speak. And I hadn't planned out exactly what I wanted to say. I wanted to hear what Sarah had to say about the topic in general, what's happening across Canada, what's happening across Ontario, and take a little bit of that and what we learned this evening and hopefully be able to give you a little bit of a lens on what's happening in Northumberland. And while I was listening to her speak and tell you some of the data and statistics and some of the things happening, I could resonate very much locally with the families, the households, the neighbors that we're serving here, and some of the situations that they find themselves in. And so, you know, I was thinking of a lot of people that I know tonight while I was listening. And some of the things that stood out for me, that term polycrisis, I really feel that one locally. I know that we're all seeing that as well. And some of the vulnerable sectors that we are serving are feeling that acutely. So that one stood out. And then as well, a broken system. And I think that we're really seeing that across the whole country when it comes to food and food insecurity and food availability. So that one resonated with me quite a lot. Here at Fair Share, we've been around for 39 years, so we're coming up on our 40th year anniversary, serving, you know, Northumberland here. We have a location in Cobourg and Port Hope. And since COVID, our numbers have doubled, which is a staggering number. When you really think about doubling the demand in your business where we have no funding outside of donations and grants that we seek out, that's a big number. And what it has caused organizations to do and charitable organizations to do is to find unique ways and unique systems and unique sources. And I heard a little bit of that tonight. And that made me feel really great to know that there is some change happening. And so within food banks, food rescue was a topic tonight. That's something that's really happening across the board. And what it's causing for us is us to link arms a little bit closer together. So once where Cobourg Port Hope's Fair Share may have operated really very much in a silo, we're reaching out across our network across Ontario now and doing things that were unheard of before, rescuing truckloads of food from industry that would have gone to waste, as Sarah mentioned. They're now getting into the food bank system. And I think that part of food charity is very valuable, very important to food insecure households, where we might get truckloads of, it might be produce, it might be alternative milks, it might be margarines, and we're moving it across the network of food banks as best we can. Obviously, that comes with other difficulties. Do we have trucks? Do we have a warehouse big enough to house it? Can we get it out fast enough before it is no longer viable, healthy food? That's some of the stuff that we at Fair Share are facing right now when we think about some of our challenges. And the other is we live in a really rural community. So while we do have a location here in Cobourg, and we have one as well in Port Hope, there's a lot more Northumberland than just those two locations. They have food banks as well, a lot of them, not all of them, but some of them operate in food deserts, as we heard Sarah talk about as well, where there's no grocery store, where people that are food insecure are now paying convenience store costs to buy their food, where people who don't have easy access to transportation or no transportation at all only have those choices for their food. So there is definitely a lot of things coming at all of our community. And some of the unique things we've tried out this year, you might have heard about them. If you follow us anywhere on our social medias or you're active with us, we did try a mobile market this year, actually, this summer with our produce. And it was quite successful. And we're just finishing our last week of it as we head into colder weather, where my volunteers assure me that they shouldn't be standing outside with tables of vegetables. So we are looking at what are we going to do next? How are we going to keep moving food across Northumberland and make sure we're using all of this food and getting it into hungry tummies? I could talk forever about this, as I'm sure you can tell now, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions afterwards, or if you want to know more about Fair Share or about food insecurity in Northumberland at all, I have some of my business cards as well. But I was just really grateful to be invited here to speak, that some of your proceeds are going to us. That was so generous and thoughtful, and I'm so grateful to you for having this conversation and helping us all learn more. So thank you, everybody.
Nothing more to say except thank you to both. And I want to let you know that next week there's no event, so don't come here, okay? We will be back on November 13th to learn how foodie culture means more than taking an Instagram photo of your restaurant meal. And don't forget, there will be a draw for a food gift certificate from our sponsor, Hermes Fine Food. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, and have a hopefully dry weekend, and go Jays. All right.